I wrote down all of my memories shortly after Elvis passed away. It was just my way of holding on. You know, I wanted to hold on and not forget. And time went on. I went forward with my life. I worked. I got married, had my son.
She never wanted to speak about this. For decades, she kept her memories locked away, protected, guarded, buried under layers of loyalty. She believed talking about her time with Elvis Presley would cheapen it, distort it, maybe even hurt the man she once planned to marry. But now, older, quieter, and no longer afraid of how the world might react, she's finally ready to reveal the truth. And the truth is nothing like what the tabloids ever printed. It isn't scandalous. It isn't cruel. It's something far more shocking. Elvis Presley, the man adored by millions, was nothing like the legend she was expected to love. He was more fragile, more frightened, more human than anyone ever imagined. She begins her story with a confession. I didn't fall in love with Elvis Presley. I fell in love with the man he didn't let the world see. That single sentence shatters every illusion the public had. Because while fans saw confidence, charm, swagger, and a voice that shook the walls, she saw the late-night panic attacks, the fear of being alone, the haunting insecurity he carried despite all the fame and attention. She saw the cost of being Elvis Presley, and it terrified her. When the engagement happened, people thought she had won the lottery. Newspapers printed headlines calling her the luckiest girl in America. They said Elvis had chosen her above all others. But she remembers that moment differently. She remembers the trembling in Elvis's hands when he slipped the ring onto her finger. The way he looked at her like he needed her, desperately. Like she was the one person who could give him something money, fame, and crowds never could. Safety. He didn't propose because he wanted a wife, she finally admits. He proposed because he wanted someone who could calm the storms inside him. And this is where her story begins to break your heart. She says Elvis carried a fear most people never suspected. It wasn't fear of losing popularity. It wasn't fear of aging or fading from the spotlight. It was a deeper, almost childlike fear. The fear that if anyone truly knew him, the real him, they would walk away. He once whispered to her, late at night when the show lights were gone and the facade faded, I don't think I deserve to be loved the way people say they love me. It stunned her. How could the most adored man on earth believe he wasn't worthy of love? But Elvis wasn't talking about fame. He was talking about his heart, his past, his pain. Pieces of himself he never let the public see. She describes moments where Elvis would sit quietly beside her, avoiding eye contact, tracing the rim of a glass, or fiddling with a watch. Any small motion to distract from whatever emotion he was swallowing. Then, suddenly, he'd open up with confessions he'd never shared with anyone else. He told her about nights he felt like a prisoner in his own home. Days where the pressure of being Elvis Presley crushed the air out of his lungs. Times he feared he'd disappoint the world simply by being human. But the moment that changed everything, the moment she says she can never forget, happened only weeks into their engagement. They were alone. No music, no entourage, no distractions. Elvis was quiet, unusually quiet, staring at the floor like he was searching for the courage to pull a truth out of himself. Finally, he said, I can play Elvis Presley better than anyone in the world, but I don't know how to play myself. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't self-pity. It was honesty, raw, trembling honesty from a man who had been performing for so long, he no longer knew where the act ended and the person began. She realized then that her engagement wasn't the sweet fairy tale the world imagined. Elvis wasn't celebrating a new beginning. He was clinging to her as if she were the last piece of normalcy he could still touch. He wasn't giving her his future, he was handing her his fear. I didn't understand it at the time, she says, her voice soft. But that night, I felt the weight he carried, and I knew it was heavier than love alone could fix. And that was only the first secret, because what Elvis told her next, the truth he made her promise to hide, was the confession that changed everything she believed about him. A truth so human, so painful, and so unlike the legend that she spent decades questioning whether the world would ever be ready to hear it. Now, she's finally ready to let it be heard. She says people always imagine being with Elvis Presley was like living inside a dream. Crowds screaming, lights flashing, music everywhere. But the truth was quieter, softer, and far more complicated than any love story the public ever built around him. Their relationship wasn't made of glitter and fame. It was made of late-night conversations, trembling honesty, and moments where Elvis let the mask slip, just long enough for her to see the man underneath. Their connection began gently. Elvis didn't sweep her off her feet like the movies show. He approached her with a strange mix of confidence and shyness, as if he didn't know how to be himself without performing. She remembers thinking he was charming, yes, but also cautious, like he was trying to figure out what version of himself she expected. In the early days, he'd tell jokes at dinner, tease her playfully, sing a line or two just to make her blush. But behind the laughter, she sensed it immediately. Elvis was hiding parts of himself. Not maliciously, not dramatically, just instinctively, the way someone does after years of being judged, adored, and misunderstood. She says the first time she saw the real Elvis was late one night, long after everyone else had gone home. He was pacing, restless, unable to settle. When she asked what was wrong, he didn't smile or pretend. He just sat down beside her, rubbed his hands together, and whispered, "I hate being alone." Not because he needed company, he had people around him constantly, but because when he was alone, he couldn't hide from his thoughts. Over time, she learned his patterns. The way he'd panic before going on stage. The way he'd collapse emotionally after a show ended and the roar of the audience vanished. The way he'd cling to her in the quiet moments, hoping the silence wouldn't swallow him. Elvis needed the noise, she explains, but the noise was killing him. He had a way of switching between two extremes, magnificent confidence in front of others and fragile uncertainty in private. She remembers watching him backstage, shoulders tense, eyes darting, the weight of an entire world pressing down on him. Then the curtain would rise, and suddenly he was Elvis again. Powerful, dazzling, unstoppable. But when the curtain fell, so did he. She talks about the nights he'd sit beside her, the room dim, the energy drained out of him. He'd confess things he never said to anyone else. "I feel like I'm fading. I don't know if people love me or the version of me they created. I wish I could breathe without pretending." These weren't dramatic statements. They were quiet admissions, spoken by a man who never learned how to voice his pain. She tried to support him, comfort him, reassure him, remind him he was more than a legend. But fame is a shadow that gets bigger every year, and Elvis had lived under it so long he couldn't tell where the shadow ended and he began. She often felt like she was holding two people, the superstar the world worshipped and the wounded soul who came undone in her arms. The deeper their relationship grew, the more she saw signs of strain. Elvis would grow silent before shows, staring into space as if bracing for a storm. He'd ask her not to leave the room, even for a moment. He'd hold her hand tightly, not to claim her, but to anchor himself. He didn't need an audience, she says softly. He needed a witness, someone who saw him, not the crown. But the most heartbreaking part came when she realized why he clung to the engagement. It wasn't the promise of a wedding or a future together. It was the fear of losing the one space where he didn't have to pretend. "Elvis, what's wrong?" She expected a deflection, a joke, anything. Instead, he lifted his head and said something that shattered her. "I don't know how much longer I can live like this. Not live as a performer. Not live under pressure." He meant live, period. Her heart dropped. She knelt beside him, took his shaking hands and waited. Slowly, Elvis opened up, not as the superstar the world adored, but as a man terrified of his own inner darkness. He told her he felt like he was disappearing. Like every day he lost another piece of himself to expectations, responsibilities, and the impossible standards he could never keep up with. He said he was tired, not physically, but spiritually tired. Tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. And then came the admission that rewrote everything she thought she knew about their engagement. "I didn't ask you to marry me because I was ready," he whispered. "I asked because I'm scared. I thought maybe love could save me from myself." She felt her heart crack open. She had always suspected their engagement had layers he never talked about, but hearing it so plainly, so painfully, made the truth impossible to ignore. Elvis hadn't proposed because he was stepping into a new chapter. He proposed because he was drowning and reaching for the closest thing that felt safe. She held his hands, trying to ground him, trying to steady the tremor in his voice. "Elvis, I'm here. You don't have to go through this alone." But he shook his head. That's when he confessed the part that broke her. "You don't understand. I love you too much to let you watch me fall apart." She froze. He wasn't pushing her away out of a lack of love. He was pushing her away because he believed he was protecting her. He talked about the fear he carried every day. The fear that she'd wake up one morning and regret choosing a man who was crumbling behind the spotlight. The fear that she'd resent the emotional storms he couldn't control. The fear that one day she'd leave and losing her would break him in a way fame never could. She tried to tell him she wasn't going anywhere, that she didn't care about the flaws, the fears, the fragile parts he kept hidden. But Elvis had already made up his mind. She saw it in his eyes. He wasn't doubting her. He was doubting himself. Then came the moment that ended everything. Elvis let her hand go, stood shakily, and said, "I don't want you to see what I'm becoming." That line cut deeper than any fight ever could. It was his final attempt to protect her from the darkness he felt consuming him. It was his admission that he no longer believed marriage would save him, only delay the inevitable heartbreak. She begged him to reconsider. He kissed her forehead, thanked her for loving him, and said the one line she still hears in her sleep: "Maybe in another life, I could have given you the version of me you deserved." The engagement didn't end with anger. It ended with grief. His grief, her grief. The grief of two people who loved each other deeply, but were standing on opposite sides of a breaking soul. She walked away that night believing Elvis pushed her out because he didn't love her enough. But years later, she learned something that changed everything. Something Elvis kept hidden. Something he left behind. That revealed the engagement hadn't ended because of weakness. It ended because of a truth he carried alone. a truth she wasn't meant to discover until after he was gone. For years after the engagement ended, she lived with a quiet, aching certainty that Elvis Presley let her go because he didn't love her enough to stay. She replayed their last conversation over and over, analyzing every word, every sigh, every moment where she wondered if she could have said something different, done something different, loved him harder, loved him better. But life has a way of revealing truths on its own timeline. It wasn't until long after Elvis passed, long after the crowd stopped screaming his name, and the world began celebrating the legend instead of mourning the man, that she learned the truth he never wanted her to carry. A truth that didn't just change how she saw their relationship, it changed how she saw him. It began with a conversation she hadn't expected. Someone close to Elvis, someone who had been with him during those final years, reached out to her, not to gossip, not to dig up old memories, but because they believed she deserved to know what Elvis had kept hidden. The moment she sat down, they said something that made her heart stop. Elvis didn't end the engagement because he didn't love you. He ended it because he loved you too much to let you witness what he knew was coming. She couldn't speak, not at first. The person continued, explaining that Elvis had known for a long time, longer than anyone publicly admitted, that his health was deteriorating. That the physical pain, the emotional strain, the pressure of holding up an entire empire had been wearing his body down far faster than he ever showed, and that he'd confided something devastating to them. "I don't want her to spend her life watching me fall apart." He didn't end the engagement because he doubted their relationship. He ended it because he believed he was sparing her a lifetime of fear, worry, and heartbreak. Her eyes filled with tears as she listened. For so long, she had carried the silent guilt of believing she wasn't enough. But now she was learning that Elvis hadn't been protecting himself. He had been protecting her. Then came the most heartbreaking revelation, one she never expected. The person reached into a drawer and handed her something small, worn and carefully kept. It was a letter, folded, fragile, with Elvis's handwriting on the front. He had written it, but never sent it. According to the friend, Elvis kept the letter near him long after the engagement ended. Her hands trembled as she opened it, reading the words he had never been brave enough to say aloud. "I didn't end our engagement because I wanted to. I ended it because you deserved a life free from the burden of mine. Loving you was the last thing that made me feel human, and I didn't want to lose that by dragging you into a storm I can't control." She pressed her hand over her mouth, tears spilling as she read line after line, words filled with love, regret, fear, and a heartbreaking tenderness Elvis never showed publicly. He wrote about his struggle to separate the man from the image, about the exhaustion he couldn't hide anymore, about how her presence had been the one calm he had left during the chaos. But the final sentence was what stayed with her the most. "If letting you go is the only way to protect you from the pain I'm heading toward, then I hope you'll forgive me someday." She cried for hours, for the loss, for the misunderstanding, for the truth she only received when it was too late to hold him and tell him he didn't need to protect her, that she would have stood by him through everything. But she also cried because she finally understood the depth of Elvis's heart. He wasn't the reckless, impulsive man people painted him as. He wasn't selfish or uncommitted. He was terrified of hurting the people he loved, terrified of letting someone witness the gradual collapse of his health, his spirit, his sense of self. By ending the engagement, Elvis believed he was saving her. And in his own deeply flawed, deeply human way, he thought that was love. She speaks now not to expose him, not to rewrite history, but to honor the man behind the crown. The man whose love was quiet, complicated, and laced with fear. The man she still thinks about when the world talks about legends, forgetting they were humans first. Elvis didn't hide the truth because he was ashamed, she says softly. He hid it because he didn't want his pain to become mine. And with that, her story ends, not with heartbreak, but with understanding. A truth finally spoken, a love finally healed, a legacy finally human. Now that Elvis's ex-fiancé has revealed the heartbreaking truth he carried alone, what do you think this says about the man behind the myth? Was his silence protection or sacrifice? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more untold stories that reveal the real Elvis Presley.